Picture this. The dim glow of a single lantern flickers across the tatami mats of a secluded chamber in Edo Castle, sometime in the 16th century. A young boy, no more than 12, kneels trembling before a battle-hardened samurai, his small hands clenched in fear and confusion. The warrior's eyes burn with a mix of desire and duty, his calloused fingers tracing the boy's silk kimono as the night air thickens with unspoken tension. Outside, cherry blossoms fall silently under the moonlit sky, but inside, a ritual unfolds, one that blends honor, power, and something far darker. This is no tale of romance. It's a glimpse into the shadowed world of samurai sexuality, where love between men was not just accepted, but codified into a system that modern eyes might call horrific. Practices that involved youths barely out of childhood, relationships built on hierarchy and obligation, and acts that blurred the lines between mentorship and exploitation. In feudal Japan, the samurai weren't just warriors of the blade, they were guardians of traditions that shocked even their contemporaries, traditions that could turn intimacy into a weapon of control and survival. Before we plunge deeper into these forgotten rituals of desire and dominance, if you're fascinated by the dark underbelly of history, the stories that make you question everything you thought you knew, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more dives into the abyss. And drop a comment below. What's the most shocking historical fact you've ever learned? It's incredible how these ancient secrets connect us across centuries, from bustling modern cities to the quiet ruins of old castles. Now, let's step back into the mist-shrouded past. The samurai class emerged during Japan's turbulent feudal era, roughly from the 12th to the 19th century, a time when warlords clashed in endless battles for power, and the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, dictated every aspect of life. But Bushido wasn't just about swordplay and seppuku. It extended into the most private corners of existence, including sexuality. In a society where women were often sequestered and marriages were political tools, male warriors turned to each other for companionship, loyalty, and yes, physical intimacy. This wasn't hidden or shameful, it was celebrated, woven into the fabric of samurai culture like the intricate patterns on a katana's hilt. Historians call it nanshoku, or male colors, a term that evokes the vibrant yet shadowed spectrum of same-sex relations that flourished among the elite. Imagine a young samurai apprentice, a wakashu, his hair styled in the distinctive forelock that marked him as not yet a man, entering the service of an older warrior, the ninja. This wasn't mere employment, it was shudo, the way of the youth, a structured relationship that promised education in martial arts, etiquette, and the samurai code, all sealed with sexual intimacy. The ninja would teach his charge how to wield a sword, how to compose poetry under the stars, and how to navigate the treacherous politics of the daimyo courts. In return, the wakashu offered his body and unwavering loyalty, a bond meant to ennoble both parties. Contemporary accounts, like those in the ancient texts of the Heian period, describe these pairings as mutually beneficial, a path to honor where desire fueled discipline. The older man, inspired to be a better role model, would fight more fiercely in battle, knowing his young lover watched from the sidelines. And the boy, he learned that survival in this brutal world meant submission, that pleasure and pain were two sides of the same blade. But peel back the romantic veneer and the horror emerges. These relationships often began when the wakashu was as young as 10 or 12. Their bodies not fully developed, their minds still forming. In a time when childhood was short and brutal, this age-structured pederasty was normalized, even ritualized. The initiation might occur in a quiet tea house, the air heavy with incense and anticipation, as the ninja whispered vows of protection while guiding the boy through acts that no child should know. Loyalty unto death was expected. Duels fought over jealousy, vendettas sparked by betrayal. One famous tale from the Sengoku period speaks of a samurai who, upon discovering his wakashu's infidelity, beheaded both the boy and his rival in a fit of rage, then composed a death poem praising the purity of their bond, even in destruction. Was this love or domination? The lines blurred as power dynamics ensured the younger partner had little choice. Refusal could mean disgrace, exile, or worse, a severed head rolling across the dojo floor. This wasn't isolated to the samurai. It echoed through Buddhist monasteries, where monks engaged in similar practices with their young acolytes, called chigo. In the shadowed halls of Mount Hiei, novices as young as 8 were paired with elder priests in relationships that mixed spiritual guidance with carnal acts. Ancient scrolls describe these unions as paths to enlightenment, the sharing of vital essence to achieve higher states of being. But whispers from the era hint at coercion, at boys torn from their families and thrust into a world where refusal meant spiritual damnation. One account from the 14th century tells of a chigo who, after years of service, took his own life rather than continue, his suicide note lamenting the loss of his innocence to the very men sworn to protect it. The irony cuts deep. In a culture that revered purity and self-control, these practices often devolved into exploitation, hidden behind veils of tradition and honor. Feudal Japan's sexual landscape was vast and varied, influenced by Shinto beliefs in natural desires and Confucian ideals of hierarchy. Women, too, played roles in this tapestry, though often as pawns. Samurai might keep concubines or visit the pleasure quarters of Yoshiwara, where courtesans trained in the arts of seduction entertained warriors fresh from the battlefield. But even here, horror lurked. Prostitution wasn't seen as sinful as in the West. It was economic, a way for families to pay debts or taxes. Yet the Yujo, the women of the floating world, faced brutal realities, forced into service as young girls, subjected to diseases without cure, and bound by contracts that made escape impossible. A samurai's visit could be tender or violent, his katana never far from reach. Stories abound of warriors who, in drunken rages, maimed or killed these women, their crimes overlooked because of their status. One chilling record from the Tokugawa era describes a daimyo who collected virgins from his domain, deflowering them in rituals meant to absorb their youthful energy, leaving broken bodies in his wake. And then there were the darker edges, practices that pushed boundaries even for the time. Some samurai engaged in what was called the Way of the Beasts, incorporating elements of pain and dominance that mirrored their battlefield ferocity. Whips fashioned from silk cords, bindings that evoked the ropes of captured enemies, these were tools not just of war, but of the bedroom. In extreme cases, historical texts hint at non-consensual acts during wartime, where victorious samurai claimed the bodies of defeated foes, both male and female, as spoils. The rape of Nanking in later centuries echoes these feudal roots. But even in the 1500s, chronicles speak of villages razed and inhabitants subjected to sexual violence as a means of terror. Was this sanctioned? Not officially, but the code of Bushido emphasized conquest, and in the chaos of civil wars, lines dissolved. As we delve deeper, remember that these practices weren't universal horrors. To many samurai, they were expressions of deep bonds in a world of constant death. Yet, from our vantage point, the age disparities, the power imbalances, and the blending of mentorship with intimacy paint a picture of systemic abuse cloaked in cultural nobility. The most horrific aspect, it was all enshrined in tradition, passed down through generations like a sacred scroll. As the feudal era wore on, particularly during the chaotic Sengoku period of the 15th and 16th centuries, these sexual traditions among samurai took on even more disturbing dimensions, evolving from structured mentorships into something that often resembled institutionalized predation. Picture a warlord's castle, its walls echoing with the clash of practiced swords by day and muffled cries by night. In such fortresses, the Shudo relationship could last for years until the Wakashu reached adulthood, marked by the ceremonial cutting of his forelock in the Genpuku rite, around age 15 to 20. But what happened if the bond soured? Jealousy among ninja could erupt into violence that made battlefield skirmishes seem tame. Historical records from the time, like the war tales in the Taiheki Chronicles, describe duels where samurai fought to the death over a favored youth, their katanas flashing under lantern light as blood soaked the tatami. One infamous incident involved Lord Takeda Shingen, a daimyo known for his military genius, who allegedly executed a rival retainer for merely gazing too long at his personal wakashu. The boy's fate? He was forced to witness the beheading, a lesson in the lethal price of beauty and desire. This possessiveness stemmed from a deeper cultural belief that the wakashu's youthful essence, or ki, could invigorate the older warrior, granting him vitality for combat. It was a philosophy borrowed from Taoist influences filtering in from China, where sexual energy was seen as a transferable force. Samurai texts, such as secret manuals passed among clans, instructed on techniques to harvest this essence through specific acts. Prolonged intimacy designed to absorb the boy's vigor without depleting one's own. But for the wakashu, this often meant endurance beyond consent, their bodies treated as vessels for a master's renewal. Whispers in Edo period diaries reveal boys who developed chronic ailments from these encounters, their spirits broken by the weight of obligation. Refusal wasn't an option. It could lead to accusations of disloyalty, punishable by banishment or ritual suicide. Imagine a 14-year-old, his face pale in the moonlight, kneeling before his ninja not out of affection but fear, knowing that one wrong word could end his family's honor. The horror deepened in the context of samurai training academies, where groups of youths lived under the strict oversight of elder warriors. These dojos weren't just for honing sword skills. They were breeding grounds for collective exploitation. Older samurai might share a wakashu among trusted allies, passing him like a communal treasure to strengthen bonds within the clan. This sharing of colors, as some scrolls euphemistically called it, was justified as building unbreakable loyalty, a network of intimacy that ensured no betrayal on the battlefield. But contemporary accounts hint at gang initiations, where a new apprentice was subjected to multiple partners in a single night, his cries dismissed as the forging of a true warrior's resolve. One chilling story from the Azuchi Momoyama period tells of a dojo in Kyoto where a rebellious wakashu was bound and educated by the entire cadre, emerging scarred in body and soul, only to take his own life by plunging a tanto into his abdomen. The master? He mourned publicly, composing haiku about lost cherry blossoms while privately selecting the next youth to fill the void. Women, often marginalized in this male-centric world, weren't spared the ripple effects of these practices. Samurai wives, bound by arranged marriages, might endure neglect as their husbands poured affection into male companions. But some women found themselves entangled in even darker rituals. In certain clans, particularly those influenced by esoteric Shinto sects, there were accounts of balancing ceremonies where a samurai would engage in acts with both a wakashu and a female consort, simultaneously believing it harmonized yin and yang energies for invincibility in war. These could devolve into coercive spectacles, with the woman, often a low-born servant, forced to participate or face retribution. Historical ledgers from the Kamakura period document cases where such rituals ended in tragedy. A consort driven mad by jealousy, poisoning her rival wakashu, only to be executed by her husband in a public display of Bushido justice. The irony. These acts were meant to embody harmony, yet they sowed seeds of discord that tore families apart. Venturing further into the shadows, we encounter practices that blended sexuality with the supernatural, drawing from ancient folklore and shamanistic beliefs. Some samurai, especially those in remote mountain strongholds, incorporated elements of what was whispered as demon binding, using intimate acts to supposedly ward off evil spirits or curse enemies. This might involve capturing a foe's young squire during battle and subjecting him to ritual violation, believing it transferred the enemy's misfortune onto themselves while stealing their luck. War chronicles from the Nanboku-cho era describe victorious lords who, after sacking a rival's castle, would select the most beautiful youths from the defeated ranks for these rites, performed under the watchful eyes of Shinto priests. The acts were brutal, often involving restraints and incantations, with the victim's suffering seen as a conduit for divine favor. One particularly gruesome tale involves a samurai who, haunted by battlefield ghosts, repeatedly assaulted his own wakashu in moonlit shrines, convinced the boy's purity would exorcise his demons. When the youth finally succumbed to injuries, the warrior interpreted it as a successful banishment, parading the body as proof of his spiritual triumph. These supernatural elements weren't mere superstition, they were weaponized in the power struggles of feudal Japan. Daimyo, like Oda Nobunaga, the ruthless unifier, allegedly used sexual dominance as a tool of intimidation, forcing surrendered lords to offer their sons as wakashu to seal alliances. Refusal meant annihilation, entire clans wiped out in flames. Nobunaga's own court was rife with such arrangements, his inner circle bound not just by oaths, but by shared intimacies that ensured silence and obedience. But when betrayal loomed, as it did in the Honnoji incident that claimed his life, these bonds proved fragile, shattering like poorly forged steel. The horror here lies in the commodification of bodies. Youths traded like horses or armor, their autonomy sacrificed on the altar of political expediency. Even in times of relative peace, like the early Tokugawa shogunate, these practices persisted, albeit more covertly. Theaters and kabuki houses became hotbeds for samurai to pursue wakashu actors, whose androgynous beauty, enhanced by makeup and elaborate costumes, blurred gender lines in ways that both enchanted and disturbed. Onagata performers, men playing female roles, often doubled as companions off stage, their services auctioned to the highest bidder among the warrior elite. But beneath the glamour, exploitation ran rampant. Young actors, many orphaned or sold into the troupe, faced nightly demands that left them hollow-eyed and broken. A scandal in 1652 saw a prominent samurai behead a kabuki youth who resisted, sparking a brief crackdown by the shogun, only for the practice to slither back into the shadows. As we peel back these layers, the systemic nature becomes clear. What was framed as noble tradition often masked cycles of abuse, where power corrupted intimacy into something monstrous. The samurai, paragons of discipline, revealed their humanity's darkest facets in these private realms, where desire and dominance danced a deadly tango. Yet as the Tokugawa era solidified its grip on Japan in the 17th century, enforcing a rigid peace that ended the constant wars, the sexual undercurrents of samurai life didn't vanish. They mutated, seeping into the underbelly of a society obsessed with order and appearances. With battles now rare, warriors turned their energies inward, and the practices that once forged battlefield alliances became tools for personal gratification and social control. In the opulent mansions of Edo, samurai lords hosted private gatherings known as moon viewings, ostensibly for poetry and sake, but often descending into orgiastic rituals where wakashu were paraded like exotic birds. These events, detailed in forbidden diaries smuggled out by disillusioned retainers, involved elaborate games of dominance. Youths blindfolded and bound with silk obi sashes, their bodies offered to guests in a lottery of chance. The host, demonstrating his power, might initiate the acts himself, his katana propped nearby as a reminder that pleasure could turn to punishment in an instant. One such account from 1680 describes a daimyo who, during a full moon feast, forced a 13-year-old wakashu to endure the attentions of a dozen retainers, claiming it built the boy's resilience. By dawn, the youth was catatonic, his spirit shattered, yet the Lord praised him as a true flower of Bushido, rewarding him with a ceremonial dagger, perhaps an invitation to end his own suffering. This era also saw the rise of contracted companionships, where impoverished samurai families sold their sons into service to wealthier clans, not unlike the geisha arrangements, but with far more sinister undertones. These contracts, sealed with wax stamps and witnessed by Shinto priests, stipulated durations, often 5 to 10 years, during which the wakashu was expected to provide unwavering devotion, including sexual submission. Refusal clauses were brutal. Breach could result in the family's lands being seized or the boy being branded a traitor, his forehead marked with ink that doomed him to a life of beggary. Historical ledgers from the Kane period reveal hundreds of such agreements, some involving boys as young as 9, their innocent faces captured in woodblock prints that circulated among the elite like illicit art. The horror amplified when these youths aged out of desirability. Discarded like worn armor, many turned to prostitution in the back alleys of Yoshiwara, their bodies ravaged by disease and abuse, their minds haunted by memories of honorable servitude. One tragic figure, a former wakashu named Hiroshi, documented in a 1700s scroll, wandered as a ronin after his ninja's death, eventually committing seppuku beside a river, his final words cursing the traditions that stole his youth. Delving into the psychological toll, these practices left invisible scars that festered across generations. Samurai literature, from the poetic death notes of the time to confessional tales in later ukiyo-e novels, hints at widespread trauma. Wakashu who grew into adults plagued by night terrors, unable to form bonds without the shadow of coercion. Some became perpetrators themselves, perpetuating the cycle by taking their own apprentices, a twisted inheritance of pain masked as legacy. Medical texts from Edo physicians, influenced by imported Dutch knowledge, began noting afflictions of the spirit among former youths, symptoms we might now recognize as PTSD, with victims withdrawing into isolation or erupting in unexplained violence. In one documented case, a mid-level samurai, once a cherished wakashu, slaughtered his entire household in a fit of madness, claiming ghosts of his past lovers demanded blood. The shogunate covered it up, attributing it to demonic possession. But insiders knew the truth. The weight of enforced intimacy had cracked his soul like brittle porcelain. Women, too, bore the brunt in increasingly horrific ways as samurai sexuality intersected with patriarchal control. Concubines, often captured from conquered territories or bought from slave markets, were subjected to loyalty tests that blended sexual endurance with torture. A warrior might command his consort to perform acts with his wakashu while he watched, judging her obedience as a measure of fidelity. Failure meant accusations of witchcraft or infidelity, punishable by drowning in a sake barrel or being buried alive in the castle gardens. Court records from the Genroku era detail a lady-in-waiting who, forced into such a triangle, poisoned herself and her unborn child, rather than continue the degradation. Her suicide poem, preserved in a hidden fan, lamented being a petal crushed between stones of desire. Even high-born wives weren't immune. Some were compelled to bear witness to their husbands' male liaisons, reinforcing their subservience in a household where emotional bonds flowed elsewhere. Pushing into even murkier depths, certain samurai sects dabbled in practices influenced by tantric Buddhism, smuggled from Tibet and India, twisting them into something grotesque. These secret rites, conducted in hidden temple annexes, involved prolonged sessions of sensory deprivation and physical strain, where participants, often a ninja and multiple wakashu, sought enlightenment through exhaustive intimacy. Bound in positions mimicking yoga asanas but extended for hours, the youths endured pain to transcend the flesh, their cries interpreted as spiritual release. Ancient manuals, now housed in restricted archives, describe herbal concoctions to heighten sensations, turning pleasure into agony. One ritual, known as the Eternal Circle, required continuous acts until exhaustion claimed all involved, supposedly forging unbreakable warrior spirits. But fatalities weren't uncommon. Boys succumbing to dehydration or internal injuries, their deaths reframed as ascension to a higher plane. A scandal in 1750 exposed a Kyoto temple where over a dozen Chigo perished in such rites, leading to a rare shogunal edict against excessive mysticism, though enforcement was lax, as many officials partook themselves. The intersection with warfare added another layer of terror. During campaigns, samurai commanders sometimes used sexual practices as morale boosters or punishments. Victorious troops might be rewarded with access to captured youths, turning POW camps into sites of mass violation. The Imjin War Chronicles, detailing invasions of Korea in the 1590s, whisper of samurai who collected war brides, euphemisms for enslaved boys and girls, subjecting them to nightly horrors under the guise of cultural assimilation. Defeated enemies faced emasculation, both literal and figurative, with survivors forced into shudo roles to break their will. One Korean account, smuggled back and later translated, describes a captured noble's son enduring such treatment until he bit through his own tongue in defiance, bleeding out rather than submit. As peace dragged on, cracks in the system widened. Foreign influences, from Portuguese traders to Jesuit missionaries, brought scrutiny, their writings decrying these sodomous vices as barbaric. Yet the samurai clung to tradition even as internal rebellions simmered, youths rising against their ninja in isolated uprisings only to be crushed. The most horrific legacy? How these practices normalized exploitation, embedding it in the DNA of a culture that prized honor above humanity. By the dawn of the 19th century, as the Tokugawa shogunate began to crumble under internal decay and external pressures, the sexual practices that had long defined samurai intimacy started to fracture, revealing fissures that exposed their most grotesque underbelly to the light. Whispers of reform echoed through the corridors of power, but not before these traditions claimed countless more victims in acts of desperation and excess. In the isolated domains of Satsuma and Choshu, where anti-shogunal sentiments brewed, daimyo lords doubled down on shudo as a means of forging fanatical loyalty among their retainers. Youths were inducted into blood oaths, rituals where intimacy was sealed with shared tattoos or ritual scars, binding them eternally to their ninja. But these oaths often masked horrific initiations. Boys subjected to branding with hot irons during the act, the pain intended to etch devotion into their flesh. One Satsuma chronicle hidden for decades recounts a 1820 ceremony where a wakashu, screaming as his skin sizzled, was told his agony mirrored the forge of a perfect blade, only for infection to claim his life. Days later, his death hailed as a martyr's sacrifice. The lords? They selected replacements without remorse, viewing such losses as the cost of unbreakable allegiance. Famous figures from this twilight era embody the darkness in stark relief. Take Saigo Takamori, the legendary samurai who would later lead the Satsuma Rebellion. In his youth, he was rumored to have maintained a stable of wakashu, training them not just in warfare, but in absolute submission through nightly lessons that blended martial discipline with erotic control. Diaries attributed to his circle describe sessions where youths were deprived of sleep and food, their endurance tested in prolonged encounters meant to build stoic resolve. One boy, barely 11, reportedly collapsed from exhaustion, his frail body discarded like a broken naginata. Saigo, ever the stoic, composed a poem likening the youth to a fallen petal. But insiders knew the truth. His practices were a microcosm of samurai excess, where mentorship devolved into sadistic mastery. Similarly, in the north, Date Masamune, the one-eyed dragon of Sendai, was said to have collected wakashu from across his domain, housing them in a private pavilion where acts of dominance included mock battles that ended in real violation. A surviving letter from a retainer begs for mercy for his son, trapped in this lair, but Masamune's response was cold. The dragon devours to grow stronger. These men, lionized as heroes in Japanese lore, carried shadows that history has often airbrushed away. The societal ripple effects were profound and horrifying, infiltrating even the lower echelons of samurai life. Ronin, masterless warriors wandering in poverty, often preyed on village boys, offering protection in exchange for companionship that quickly turned coercive. In rural outposts, these drifters established makeshift dojos, luring orphans with promises of glory, only to ensnare them in cycles of abuse. Folk tales from the Bunsei era speak of ghost ronin, spectral figures who haunted roadsides, abducting youths for nocturnal rites before vanishing like mist. One verified incident in 1835 involved a band of ronin who raided a fishing village, claiming 5 boys as recruits and subjecting them to group initiations under the stars. When villagers rose up, the ronin slaughtered them, leaving the youths traumatized survivors who later formed vigilante groups to hunt their tormentors. This vigilante backlash hinted at growing unrest as the common folk began to see these practices not as elite traditions, but as predatory crimes. Women's roles in this decaying system grew even more tragic, often becoming unwilling participants in rituals of humiliation. Samurai widows, left destitute after their husbands' deaths in duels over wakashu rivalries, might be forced into concubinage with their late spouse's ninja, their bodies bartered to settle debts of honor. In extreme cases, clans practiced inheritance sharing, where a deceased warrior's wife and wakashu were both bequeathed to his successor, creating twisted households of enforced polyamory. A heartbreaking account from the Tempo reforms era details a widow named Akiko, compelled to share her bed with her husband's teenage companion while the new lord watched, ensuring continuity of loyalty. Driven to despair, she drowned herself in a well, her ghost said to haunt the estate, whispering curses that drove the lord to madness. Such stories proliferated, fueling underground literature that dared to critique the samurai code, though authors risked execution for sedition. Venturing into the occult fringes, some samurai turned to forbidden arts, influenced by Ainu shamanism from the north or Ryukyuan mysticism from the south, incorporating hallucinogenic herbs into their rites. These spirit unions involved dosing wakashu with potions derived from toxic plants, inducing visions during intimacy that blurred reality and nightmare. Participants believed they communed with ancestral kami, but the results were often fatal. Youths convulsing in agony as visions turned to terrors, their hearts giving out under the strain. A 1840 incident in Hokkaido saw a samurai shaman force a group of Ainu boys into such a ritual, claiming it would grant him invincibility against Western intruders. All but one perished, foaming at the mouth, while the survivor fled to tell tales that inflamed anti-samurai sentiments among indigenous peoples. As Western ships like Perry's Black Fleet anchored in Japanese harbors by 1853, forcing open the isolationist gates, these practices faced unprecedented scrutiny. Missionaries and diplomats penned shocked reports, comparing samurai customs to ancient Greek pederasty but decrying them as barbaric relics. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 accelerated the decline, as the new imperial government sought to modernize and westernize, abolishing the samurai class and criminalizing many traditional acts under new moral codes. Yet, the transition was bloody. Die-hard traditionalists clung to Shudo in secret enclaves, leading to clandestine raids where enforcers discovered hidden chambers of horror. Youths chained and emaciated, their rescuers weeping at the sight. One final uprising in 1877, the Satsuma Rebellion, saw remnants of the old ways, warriors sharing last rites with their wakashu before charging into gunfire, their bonds a defiant echo of a fading era. The psychological legacy lingered like a persistent fog, influencing everything from kabuki theater's lingering androgyny to modern yakuza codes that echo Shudo hierarchies. Historians now unearth diaries and scrolls, piecing together the human cost, thousands of lives warped by a system that glorified exploitation under the banner of honor. What drove these warriors to such depths? Was it the isolation of their code, the constant shadow of death, or something innate in power's corrupting embrace? As we reflect, the true horror emerges not just in the acts, but in how a society could enshrine them as virtue, blinding itself to the suffering beneath. But to truly grasp the profundity of this blindness, we must confront the voices that were silenced, the untold stories of those who lived through the nightmare, their testimonies buried in fragmented scrolls and oral histories passed down in secret. Consider the wakashu who survived to adulthood, their bodies marked by scars both visible and invisible, navigating a world that expected them to perpetuate the very system that devoured their innocence. In the quiet villages of post-Restoration Japan, elders whispered of men who, once cherished youths, became reclusive hermits, haunted by memories that surfaced in opium-laced dreams. One such survivor, documented in an anonymous Meiji-era memoir smuggled to the West, described his ninja's lessons as a thief in the night, stealing pieces of his soul until nothing remained but a hollow shell. He wrote of nights spent in fetal curls, praying to Amaterasu for oblivion, only to rise and train the next generation, trapped in the cycle like a rat in a bamboo trap. The horror. These men often defended the traditions publicly, their trauma internalized as necessary forging, a testament to how deeply the Bushido Code indoctrinated its victims. This indoctrination extended to the family unit, where samurai households became microcosms of normalized abuse. Fathers might groom their own sons for Shudo arrangements, viewing it as a path to advantageous alliances, blind to the generational wounds inflicted. In the waning days of the shogunate, as economic pressures mounted, desperate clans auctioned boys at underground markets disguised as tea ceremonies. Their prices haggled over like bolts of silk. A chilling ledger from 1860 lists over 50 such transactions in Kyoto alone, with notations on the youth's purity and endurance potential. Buyers, often aging warriors nostalgic for their glory days, subjected these boys to regimens that included isolation in dark chambers, where sensory deprivation amplified the terror of intimacy. One boy's fate, pieced together from court records after the Restoration, ended in a botched escape. Caught fleeing his ninja's estate, he was returned and re-educated through days of unrelenting acts, emerging a broken mute who later hanged himself from a sacred torii gate, his silent protest defiling the shrine. Women's suffering, too, evolved in these final decades, morphing into a quiet epidemic of despair that simmered beneath the surface of polite society. Samurai daughters, raised in seclusion, were sometimes initiated into the fringes of these practices through observance rituals, forced to witness their brothers' or fathers' liaisons as a lesson in obedience. This exposure bred a legacy of psychological torment. Many grew into wives who viewed intimacy with revulsion, their marriages crumbling under the weight of inherited trauma. Historical novels from the era, veiled as fiction to evade censors, depict noble women who turn to poison or self-mutilation to escape unwanted advances, their acts framed as honorable resistance. One real-life case from the Boshin War period involved a daimyo's consort who, after enduring years of her husband's divided affections, orchestrated a fire that consumed their castle, taking wakashu and retainers alike in the blaze. Her final words, etched into a charred fan, "Let the flames cleanse what honor could not." Such acts of defiance, rare as they were, chipped away at the facade, inspiring underground networks of women who smuggled abused youths to safety, risking their lives in a shadow war against tradition. On the supernatural front, as Japan grappled with modernization, remnants of esoteric practices clung like barnacles to sinking ships. In remote enclaves, rogue samurai formed cults, blending Shudo with imported occultism from Europe, grimoires smuggled by Dutch traders, creating hybrids of horror. These midnight circles involved rituals where wakashu were drugged with opium and belladonna, their hallucinations guided toward visions of conquest, but often spiraling into madness. Participants claimed communion with yokai spirits, using the youth's bodies as altars for invocations that promised eternal youth or battlefield prowess. A 1870 raid on such a cult in the mountains of Shikoku uncovered a chamber of nightmares. Emaciated boys chained to stone pedestals, their skin etched with arcane symbols, several already dead from ritual bleedings. The leader, a disgraced ronin, defended it as the true Bushido, unbound by weak emperors, before being executed. These cults represented the death throes of a system, desperation twisting tradition into outright monstrosity. The global gaze intensified the reckoning. As Japan opened to the world, foreign observers like Isabella Bird and Lafcadio Hearn documented these practices in travelogues that shocked Victorian sensibilities, comparing them to the scandals of ancient Rome or the harems of Ottoman sultans. Their writings fueled international pressure, but also sparked a defensive backlash. Samurai apologists penned treatises claiming Nanshoku was a pure expression of warrior brotherhood, superior to the decadent heteronormativity of the West. Yet, beneath this, reformist voices emerged, intellectuals influenced by Enlightenment ideas, advocating for the abolition of child exploitation under the guise of progress. The Meiji government's 1872 edicts against immoral customs targeted Shudo explicitly, though enforcement was spotty, with many practices driven underground into yakuza dens or geisha houses. Psychologically, the scars ran deep, influencing Japan's modern identity in subtle, haunting ways. Post-war studies by anthropologists like Ruth Benedict in The Chrysanthemum and the Sword hint at how these feudal legacies shaped concepts of shame and hierarchy, with echoes in everything from corporate loyalty to familial dynamics. Survivors' descendants in anonymous interviews from the 20th century spoke of inherited silences, grandfathers who never touched their wives tenderly, uncles who vanished into monasteries, their traumas unspoken burdens. The horror persists in literature and film. Works like Yukio Mishima's Confessions of a Mask grapple with the internalized conflict, while movies such as Taboo, Gohato dramatize the lethal jealousy of Shudo, reminding us that these practices weren't relics, but living wounds. As we approach the end of this shadowy journey, the patterns crystallize. A culture's elevation of power over empathy, tradition over humanity, created a breeding ground for atrocities cloaked in nobility. The samurai, icons of discipline and grace, revealed through their intimacies the monstrous potential lurking in unchecked authority. What lessons does this hold for us today, in a world still grappling with power imbalances and hidden abuses? The echoes reverberate, urging vigilance against the seduction of honorable facades that mask suffering. Indeed, those echoes aren't mere historical footnotes. They pulse through time, challenging us to examine how such practices, born in the crucibles of feudal power, have left indelible marks on Japan's cultural psyche and beyond. Picture a modern Tokyo skyscraper, its glass facade reflecting the neon glow of progress while in the shadows of memory. The ghosts of Wakashu wander, reminders that horror doesn't die with an era, but metamorphoses, influencing everything from literature to law. In the 20th century, as Japan rebuilt from the ashes of World War II, scholars began unearthing suppressed texts, revealing how samurai sexuality informed the rigid hierarchies of imperial militarism. The kamikaze pilots, for instance, drew from Bushido's emphasis on ultimate loyalty, a direct descendant of Shudo's binding oaths, where young men offered their lives as willingly as feudal youths offered their bodies. Post-war analyses like those in Ian Baruma's The Wages of Guilt suggest that the suppression of these histories contributed to Japan's collective amnesia, a national trauma where unacknowledged abuses festered into societal ills like karoshi, death from overwork, or the isolation of hikikomori, echoing the emotional withdrawal of traumatized wakashu. Delving deeper, the most horrific practices didn't always manifest in overt violence, but in the insidious erosion of free will, where consent was an illusion woven from cultural threads. In the late Edo period, as famines ravaged the land, samurai lords instituted fidelity lotteries, random drawings among their retainers to assign wakashu for seasonal renewal rites. These lotteries, disguised as divine will through Shinto oracles, ensured no youth escaped service, their names pulled from bamboo lots in temple ceremonies. A participant's account, preserved in a Kyoto archive, describes the dread of hearing one's name called, followed by months of enforced intimacy in secluded pavilions, where escape meant not just personal ruin, but the shaming of one's entire lineage. One youth, selected repeatedly due to his ethereal beauty, documented his descent. From initial resignation to hallucinatory breakdowns, convinced his ninja was a Tengu demon feasting on his soul. His end came via jigai, self-inflicted throat slashing, a method typically reserved for women, underscoring the gender-blurring torment of his existence. These lotteries exemplified systemic horror. A lottery of birth into samurai society could doom a boy to a life of objectification, his value measured in how well he sated the desires of the powerful. The intersection with medicine and pseudoscience added layers of grotesque experimentation. Influenced by Rangaku, Dutch learning, some enlightened samurai dabbled in anatomy, using wakashu as subjects for vitality studies. In hidden laboratories within castle compounds, youths were subjected to procedures blending intimacy with crude surgeries, incisions to enhance flow of ki, or applications of mercury-based elixirs believed to prolong youth but often causing madness or sterility. A 1850s journal from a Nagasaki physician samurai details experiments where boys were bound and stimulated for hours, while vital signs were monitored with imported instruments, their pain dismissed as data points in pursuit of eternal warrior vigor. One subject, a 12-year-old orphan, endured repeated sessions until his body failed, convulsing in agony as mercury poisoned his blood. The doctor noted it clinically. Essence extraction incomplete. Subject expired at dawn. This fusion of tradition and imported science represented a pinnacle of horror, humanity reduced to experimental fodder, justified by a warped quest for immortality. Women's narratives from this era paint equally harrowing pictures, often overlooked in male-dominated histories. Concubines in samurai harems faced purification trials, rituals where they were forced to compete with wakashu for their lord's favor through endurance contests of intimacy. These could involve hours of performative acts in front of assembled retainers, with losers facing banishment or worse. A rare female-penned scroll from 1845 recounts a trial in which a consort, pregnant with her lord's child, was compelled to participate, resulting in miscarriage amid the ordeal. Her lord, unmoved, declared it a sign of weak bloodlines, replacing her with a younger Wakashu. She later joined a network of shadow sisters, secret societies of abused women who poisoned abusive husbands or smuggled children to safety, their acts a subterranean rebellion against the patriarchy. These groups, operating like ninjas in the night, assassinated several notorious daimyo, their daggers laced with slow-acting toxins that mimicked natural death. The horror lay in their necessity. Women driven to murder to reclaim agency in a system that treated them as interchangeable vessels. Even children born of these unions carried the burden, often raised in environments where the lines between affection and abuse blurred from infancy. Illegitimate sons of Wakashu relationships were sometimes inducted early into Shudo, perpetuating the cycle with a vengeance. In one documented clan from the Kyoho era, a daimyo fathered children with his consort while maintaining Wakashu lovers, then trained his offspring in family traditions from age 8, creating a dynasty of internalized trauma. Descendants of such lines, interviewed in modern ethnographies, report familial curses, patterns of dysfunction, from domestic violence to suicide clusters, tracing back to these feudal roots. The psychological imprint was profound, with Freudian echoes of repressed desires manifesting in Japan's early 20th century militarism, where homoerotic undertones in soldier bonds harkened back to samurai brotherhoods. As westernization accelerated, the clash produced hybrid horrors, samurai adopting Victorian prudery on the surface while clinging to old ways in private. Secret societies formed like the Order of the Hidden Blade, where die-hard traditionalists conducted underground rites, abducting street urchins for revived Shudo ceremonies. A 1880 police raid in Tokyo uncovered one such den, a basement lair with youths drugged and restrained, surrounded by ancient scrolls and modern chloroform bottles. The leader, a former samurai turned yakuza, ranted about preserving Japan's soul against foreign corruption before being hanged. These holdouts illustrated the tenacity of horror, traditions mutating to survive, like a virus adapting to new hosts. Reflecting on this tapestry of suffering, we see how power, unchecked by empathy, breeds monstrosities that echo across centuries. The samurai's sexual practices, once enshrined as noble, reveal the fragility of cultural relativism. What one age calls honor, another deems atrocity. In our connected world, where histories are unearthed and scrutinized, these stories serve as cautions, reminders to question traditions that demand sacrifice of the vulnerable. As cherry blossoms fall in eternal cycles, so too do the veils over hidden truths, urging us to listen to the silenced screams and build a future where intimacy heals rather than harms.